The year was 1871, and the streets of South Boston were filled with children playing games and running between the narrow houses. Most families in this working-class neighborhood struggled to put food on their tables, but they found ways to be happy. Children would play marbles in the dirt roads and chase each other around the wooden buildings that lined the streets. But in one small house on Broadway Street lived a family that was different from all the others. The Pomeroy family seemed normal from the outside, but inside their home something dark was growing. Ruth Pomeroy worked as a seamstress, trying to make enough money to feed her two sons. Her husband had left the family years ago, and she was raising the boys alone. Her younger son, Jesse, was born on November 29th in 1859. From the moment he came into this world, Jesse was not like other children. His hair was completely white, which made him stand out among the other kids with brown and black hair. But what made people stare at Jesse was his eyes. One eye was brown and normal-looking, but the other eye was cloudy white from an accident he had when he was very young. The other children in the neighborhood would point at Jesse and whisper about his strange appearance. They called him names and ran away when he tried to join their games. Jesse learned early in life that he was different, and that difference made other people afraid of him. Ruth Pomeroy loved her son, but she noticed that Jesse was not developing like other children his age. When Jesse was 5 years old, she caught him pulling the wings off flies in their small backyard. Most children might do this once out of curiosity, but Jesse did it over and over again. He would sit for hours catching insects and slowly taking them apart piece by piece. When Ruth asked Jesse why he hurt the bugs, he would look at her with his mismatched eyes and smile. He told his mother that he liked the way the bugs moved when he hurt them. This answer made Ruth feel cold inside, but she told herself that all children went through phases of curiosity about living things. As Jesse grew older, his behavior became more concerning. The family had a small cat that lived in their house and helped catch mice. One day, Ruth came home from work to find the cat hiding under their kitchen table. The animal was shaking and had scratches all over its body. When she asked Jesse what happened to the cat, he said it had fallen down the stairs. But Ruth noticed that the scratches looked like they had been made by small hands, not from a fall. She watched Jesse more carefully after that day and saw him corner the cat when he thought no one was looking. Jesse would grab the animal and hold it tight while it tried to escape. His face would change when he did this, and his eyes would get bright with excitement. The neighbors began to notice Jesse too. Mrs. Sullivan, who lived next door, told Ruth that Jesse had asked her 5-year-old son, Billy, to come play in the Pomeroy backyard. When Billy came home that day, he was crying and had dirt all over his clothes. Billy told his mother that Jesse had pushed him down and stood on his chest until he could not breathe properly. Ruth confronted Jesse about this incident, but her son looked confused and said he was only playing a game with Billy. Jesse explained that he wanted to see what would happen if someone could not breathe for a while. He seemed genuinely puzzled about why this would be wrong or why Billy had been scared. Other strange incidents began to happen around the neighborhood. Small animals would be found dead in unusual ways. A dog was discovered tied to a fence post with rope burns around its neck. 3 cats were found in an alley with their fur cut off in patches. The adults in the neighborhood whispered about these discoveries, but no one could prove who was responsible. Jesse was now 12 years old and attending school with the other children in South Boston. His teachers noticed that he was very intelligent and could read and write better than most children his age, but they also noticed that Jesse never seemed to have friends and that other students avoided sitting near him during lessons. During recess, Jesse would stand alone against the school building and watch the other children play their games. His expression was always serious and calculating, as if he was studying the other kids like they were insects under a magnifying glass. When teachers tried to encourage Jesse to join the games, he would say he preferred to watch. One afternoon in late November of 1871, Jesse was walking home from school when he saw 4-year-old Billy Payne playing alone near the docks. Billy was the son of a sailor and often played by himself while his father was away at sea. The little boy was building small towers out of stones and knocking them down with sticks. Jesse approached Billy and asked if he wanted to play a new game. Billy was lonely and excited to have an older boy pay attention to him, so he agreed to follow Jesse to a quiet area behind some warehouses. What happened next in that isolated spot would be the beginning of a reign of terror that would shock the city of Boston and make Jesse Pomeroy famous across America. When Billy Payne returned home that evening, his mother barely recognized him. His clothes were torn and dirty, and he could barely speak through his tears. Billy told his mother that the white-haired boy had hurt him with pins and a small knife. He said Jesse had told him they were playing doctor, but that the games had hurt very badly. Billy's mother immediately took her son to the local doctor, who examined the child and found dozens of small puncture wounds across his body. The doctor had never seen injuries like this on a child and was disturbed by how deliberate and planned the wounds appeared to be. Someone had spent a long time carefully hurting this little boy. The police were called and they began asking questions around the neighborhood about who might have attacked Billy Payne. Several people mentioned seeing the strange Pomeroy boy talking to Billy earlier that day. When the police went to speak with Jesse, they found a calm and polite 12-year-old boy who seemed confused about why they were asking him questions. Jesse denied hurting Billy and said he had been at home all afternoon. But when the police searched Jesse's room, they found several sharp pins hidden under his mattress, along with a small knife that had what looked like dried blood on the blade. Confronted with this evidence, Jesse finally admitted that he had played games with Billy but said he had not meant to hurt the younger boy. This confession marked the beginning of one of the most disturbing criminal cases in American history. Jesse Pomeroy had taken his first victim and discovered that he enjoyed the feeling of power and control that came from hurting someone smaller and weaker than himself. The monster had been born, and South Boston would never be the same again. After the attack on Billy Payne, the police in South Boston thought they had solved their problem. They warned Jesse Pomeroy to stay away from other children and told his mother, Ruth, to watch him more carefully. But what they did not understand was that Jesse had discovered something that excited him more than anything else in his young life. The feeling of complete power over another human being had awakened something dark and hungry inside him. Winter passed into spring, and the neighborhoods around Boston began to see more children playing outside in the warmer weather. Jesse watched these children from his bedroom window with growing interest. His mother had forbidden him from leaving the house alone, but Jesse was clever and patient. He waited for the right moments when Ruth was busy with her sewing work to slip out of the house unnoticed. On a cold February morning in 1872, 7-year-old Johnny Balk was walking to school through the streets of Chelsea. Johnny lived with his grandmother, who worked long hours at a textile factory and often had to walk to school by himself. The boy was small for his age and moved slowly through the crowded streets carrying his books in a cloth bag. Jesse had been watching Johnny for several days and knew the exact route the boy took to school each morning. He also knew that there was a quiet alley behind the bakery where no one would see them or hear anything that might happen. Jesse positioned himself near the bakery and waited patiently for Johnny to walk by. When Johnny appeared, Jesse stepped out from behind a wooden cart and smiled at the younger boy. He told Johnny that he knew a shortcut to school that would save him 10 minutes of walking. Johnny was always late for school, and the idea of a shortcut seemed wonderful, so he followed Jesse into the narrow alley. What happened next was even worse than what Jesse had done to Billy Payne. Jesse had brought a small bag filled with pins, needles, and a sharp piece of broken glass. He told Johnny that they were going to play a game called Doctor and Patient. Jesse explained that Johnny would be the patient and that he needed to lie very still while Jesse examined him. Johnny became frightened when Jesse began taking off his clothes and tried to run away. But Jesse was bigger and stronger and easily caught the 7-year-old boy. Jesse forced Johnny to lie on the cold ground behind the bakery and began what he called his examination. Jesse used the pins to make small holes all over Johnny's arms and legs. He told the terrified boy that this was normal for a doctor's visit and that he needed to be brave and quiet. When Johnny started to cry, Jesse covered his mouth with his hand and whispered that good patients did not make noise during their treatment. The attack lasted for nearly an hour, and when Jesse was finished, Johnny could barely stand up. Jesse helped the boy put his clothes back on and warned him not to tell anyone about their doctor game. Jesse said that if Johnny told anyone about what happened, he would find him again, and the next game would be much worse. Johnny stumbled home from school that day in terrible pain and covered in dozens of small wounds. His grandmother immediately saw that something horrible had happened and took the boy to the local doctor. The doctor was shocked by the systematic nature of the injuries and called the police right away. When the police questioned Johnny, the frightened boy was too scared to give them a clear description of his attacker. He only remembered that the older boy had white hair and strange eyes. This description immediately made the police think of Jesse Pomeroy, but Johnny was too traumatized to identify Jesse when they brought him to look at the suspect. Jesse denied any involvement in the attack on Johnny Balk, and his mother, Ruth, provided an alibi saying that Jesse had been home sick that day. Without a positive identification from the victim, the police could not prove that Jesse was responsible for the attack. But Jesse was just getting started with his reign of terror. 3 weeks after the attack on Johnny Balk, another incident occurred in the nearby town of Dorchester. 6-year-old Peter Gould was playing in a park near his home when a white-haired boy approached him and asked if he wanted to see something interesting in the woods behind the park. Peter was a curious child and followed Jesse into the wooded area where no one could see them. Jesse had prepared for this attack by hiding a collection of sharp objects in a hollow tree the day before. This time, Jesse spent even longer tormenting his victim and seemed to enjoy the process more with each passing minute. Jesse made Peter remove all his clothes and lie on a bed of leaves while he used pins and a small knife to create patterns of cuts and puncture wounds all over the boy's body. Jesse told Peter that he was creating artwork on his skin and that he should feel honored to be chosen as Jesse's canvas. Peter screamed and begged Jesse to stop, but the white-haired boy seemed to become more excited by the younger child's fear and pain. Jesse would pause between attacks to study Peter's face and seemed fascinated by the different expressions of terror and agony that appeared there. When Jesse finally finished with Peter Gould, he had created over 50 small wounds covering the boy's arms, legs, and torso. Jesse carefully cleaned his tools and hid them back in the hollow tree before helping Peter get dressed. He gave the same warning he had given to Johnny about not telling anyone about their game. Peter managed to make it home but collapsed on his front porch from pain and blood loss. His parents rushed him to the hospital where doctors worked for hours to clean and bandage all of his wounds. The systematic and deliberate nature of the injuries horrified the medical staff, who had never seen anything like this before. The attacks continued throughout the spring and early summer of 1872. Jesse struck again and again, always choosing victims who were young, small, and vulnerable. 7-year-old Robert Gould was attacked in May. 5-year-old Joseph Kennedy was tortured in June. 4-year-old George Pratt became a victim in July. Each attack was more vicious and prolonged than the last as Jesse refined his methods and grew bolder in his actions. He began to develop a ritual around the attacks, always bringing the same tools and always telling his victims they were playing doctor games. Jesse seemed to feed off the fear and helplessness of the children he attacked. The police began to notice the pattern connecting all these attacks. Every victim described an older boy with white hair and mismatched eyes. Every attack involved the same type of systematic torture with pins and knives. Every victim was found in isolated locations where the attacker could work without being disturbed. Detective James Wood was assigned to investigate the growing number of child attacks around Boston. Detective Wood had 20 years of experience dealing with criminals, but he had never encountered anything like this series of attacks. The methodical nature of the violence and the young age of both the attacker and victims was unlike anything in his experience. As summer turned to fall, the community around Boston lived in fear. Parents began walking their children to school and refused to let them play outside alone. The white-haired demon, as some people began calling him, had terrorized an entire city and showed no signs of stopping his attacks. But Jesse Pomeroy's luck was about to run out, and his career as America's youngest serial predator was approaching its end. The summer of 1872 was coming to an end, and Detective James Wood was no closer to catching the white-haired boy who had been terrorizing the children of Boston. 7 young victims had survived attacks, and their descriptions all pointed to the same suspect. But catching a 12-year-old boy who seemed to appear and disappear like a ghost was proving more difficult than anyone had expected. Detective Wood decided to try a different approach. Instead of waiting for the next attack, he began studying the pattern of where and when the previous attacks had occurred. He spread a large map of Boston across his desk and marked each location with a red pin. After staring at the map for hours, Wood began to see something that had not been obvious before. All of the attacks had happened within walking distance of South Boston, where Jesse Pomeroy lived with his mother. The attacks also seemed to follow the routes that children would take to and from school. Detective Wood realized that the attacker was not choosing his victims randomly, but was carefully studying their daily routines before striking. Wood began sending police officers to watch the schools and playgrounds in South Boston. He instructed his men to look for any boy with white hair who seemed to be paying too much attention to the younger children. The detective also asked teachers and parents to report any suspicious behavior they might notice. On September 21, 1872, Officer Patrick Murphy was watching the playground at the Bigelow School when he noticed a white-haired boy standing alone near the fence. The boy was not playing with the other children but seemed to be studying them carefully. Officer Murphy moved closer and saw that the boy had one brown eye and one cloudy white eye. Officer Murphy had seen the descriptions of the suspected attacker and knew immediately that he was looking at Jesse Pomeroy. But the officer also knew that he needed to be careful because Jesse had not actually committed a crime while Murphy was watching him. The officer decided to follow Jesse when school ended to see where he would go. Jesse left the school playground and began walking through the streets of South Boston. Officer Murphy stayed far enough behind so that Jesse would not notice him, but close enough to see everything the boy was doing. Jesse walked slowly and seemed to be looking for something or someone specific. After 20 minutes of walking, Jesse stopped near a group of younger children who were playing marbles in a vacant lot. Jesse stood at the edge of the lot and watched the children for several minutes. Officer Murphy saw Jesse focus his attention on a small 6-year-old boy who was playing alone at the far end of the group. Jesse began walking toward the 6-year-old boy, and Officer Murphy knew that he had to act immediately. The officer ran across the street and grabbed Jesse by the arm just as he was approaching the younger child. Jesse looked surprised but not frightened when Officer Murphy identified himself as a police officer. Officer Murphy arrested Jesse Pomeroy and took him to the South Boston Police Station, where Detective Wood was waiting to question him. Jesse sat calmly in the small interview room and answered all of Detective Wood's questions in a polite and respectful manner. The detective had questioned many criminals over the years, but he had never met anyone quite like Jesse Pomeroy. When Detective Wood asked Jesse about the attacks on the 7 children, Jesse did not deny his involvement. Instead, he spoke about the incidents as if they were interesting experiments that he had conducted. Jesse explained that he had been curious about how much pain different children could tolerate before they would start crying or begging him to stop. Detective Wood was disturbed by Jesse's calm and scientific attitude toward the horrible crimes he had committed. The detective asked Jesse if he understood that he had seriously hurt innocent children and caused them terrible suffering. Jesse looked confused by this question and said that he had been very careful not to cause any permanent damage to his victims. Jesse went on to explain that he had studied medical books from the library to make sure he knew how to hurt the children without killing them. He said that killing them would have ended the experiments too quickly, and that he was more interested in studying their reactions to pain over longer periods of time. The interview with Jesse lasted for 3 hours, and Detective Wood found himself becoming more disturbed with each passing minute. Jesse showed no signs of guilt or remorse for what he had done to the 7 children. Instead, he seemed proud of his careful planning and execution of the attacks. When Detective Wood asked Jesse if he planned to attack more children in the future, Jesse said that he probably would because the experiments were teaching him interesting things about human nature. Jesse explained that he wanted to try different methods of causing pain to see if older children would react differently than younger ones. The next morning, Jesse Pomeroy appeared in court to face charges for the attacks on 7 children. The courthouse was packed with angry parents and community members who wanted to see justice done. Many people in the crowd were shocked when they saw how young and normal-looking Jesse appeared to be. Jesse's mother, Ruth, sat in the front row of the courtroom and wept quietly as the prosecutor described the horrible things her son had done to innocent children. Ruth could not understand how the boy she had raised and loved could have become such a monster. She blamed herself for not seeing the warning signs earlier and not getting help for Jesse when his behavior first became disturbing. The judge who presided over Jesse's case had never dealt with such a young defendant who had committed such serious crimes. The legal system in 1872 was not prepared to handle a 12-year-old serial attacker, and there were no clear guidelines about how such a case should be handled. After hearing testimony from the victims and their families, the judge found Jesse guilty of assault and battery on 7 children. Because of Jesse's young age, the judge sentenced him to confinement at the Westboro Reform School until he reached the age of 21. This meant that Jesse would spend the next 9 years in the reform school, where officials hoped they could teach him to control his violent impulses. Jesse listened to his sentence without showing any emotion and seemed more interested in looking around the crowded courtroom than in paying attention to the judge's words. When asked if he had anything to say before being taken away, Jesse simply said that he hoped the reform school would have a good library so he could continue his studies. The people of Boston breathed a sigh of relief when Jesse Pomeroy was finally taken away to the Westboro Reform School. Parents felt safe letting their children play outside again, and the nightmare that had gripped the city for months seemed to be over. But what nobody realized was that sending Jesse to reform school would not cure him of his violent desires. Jesse Pomeroy was about to spend 2 years learning new skills and growing stronger while planning what he would do when he was eventually released back into society. The monster had been captured, but he was far from being contained, and the worst was yet to come. The Westboro Reform School was located 30 miles outside of Boston and was designed to house troubled boys between the ages of 7 and 16. The school officials believed that with proper education, discipline, and religious instruction, they could turn even the most difficult children into productive members of society. When Jesse Pomeroy arrived at Westboro in September 1872, the staff was confident they could cure him of his violent tendencies. Jesse was assigned to a small room that he shared with another boy named Thomas, who had been sent to the school for stealing money from his employer. Thomas was nervous about sharing a room with someone who had hurt other children, but Jesse seemed polite and well-behaved during his first weeks at the school. The daily routine at Westboro was strict and structured. The boys woke up at 5 in the morning and attended chapel services before eating breakfast. They spent the morning hours in classroom learning, reading, writing, and arithmetic. The afternoon was devoted to manual labor, where the boys learned useful trades like carpentry, farming, and printing. Jesse adapted to the routine at Westboro better than anyone expected. He was an excellent student and quickly became one of the top performers in his classes. Jesse read every book in the school library and impressed his teachers with his ability to discuss complex topics. The staff began to believe that Jesse's violent behavior had been caused by boredom and lack of proper education, but Jesse's roommate Thomas began to notice things about Jesse that the teachers did not see. Thomas watched Jesse carefully during the night and saw him practicing strange movements with his hands, as if he was holding invisible tools. Jesse would lie in his bed and move his fingers in cutting and stabbing motions while staring at the ceiling with a blank expression. Thomas also noticed that Jesse collected small objects from around the school grounds. Jesse would pick up sharp stones, pieces of broken glass, and bent nails and hide them in a secret place under his mattress. When Thomas asked Jesse why he collected these things, Jesse said they were for art projects he was planning to work on someday. The most disturbing thing Thomas observed was how Jesse reacted when other boys at the school got into fights or accidents. Whenever someone was hurt, Jesse would move closer to watch what was happening. His eyes would become bright and focused, and he seemed to enjoy seeing other people in pain. Jesse never helped injured boys or showed any sympathy for their suffering. After 18 months at Westboro, Jesse had become a model student, and the staff began discussing the possibility of an early release. Jesse had shown no violent behavior during his time at the school and seemed to have learned to control his impulses. The school's director, Dr. William Stearns, wrote several reports praising Jesse's progress and recommending that he be given a chance to return to society. Jesse's mother, Ruth, had visited him regularly during his time at Westboro and was overjoyed when she learned that her son might be released early. Ruth had moved to a new apartment in South Boston and found a better-paying job so she could provide Jesse with a fresh start when he came home. She believed that her son had been cured of his violent tendencies and was ready to become a normal teenager. On February 6, 1874, Jesse Pomeroy walked out of the Westboro Reform School as a free 14-year-old boy. He had served only 17 months of his 9-year sentence and was being released on the condition that he would be closely supervised by his mother and would report regularly to a probation officer. Jesse returned to South Boston and found that the neighborhood had changed during his absence. Many of the families who had lived there when he was younger had moved away and new people had taken their places. Jesse was relieved that most of his new neighbors did not know about his past crimes and would give him a chance to start over. Ruth Pomeroy had used her savings to open a small shop that sold newspapers, candy, and tobacco products. She hoped that working in the shop would keep Jesse busy and help him stay out of trouble. Jesse seemed genuinely interested in helping with the business and spent his days arranging merchandise and serving customers. But Jesse's calm and helpful behavior was just an act that he was performing for his mother and the probation officer. Inside his mind, Jesse was thinking constantly about the attacks he had committed before going to reform school. During his time at Westboro, Jesse had spent many hours remembering every detail of what he had done to his 7 victims. Jesse had also used his time in the school library to read medical books and learn more about human anatomy. He studied diagrams of the human body and read about different ways that people could be injured or killed. Jesse told the librarian that he was interested in becoming a doctor someday, but his real purpose was much more sinister. 3 weeks after his release, Jesse began walking around the neighborhoods near his mother's shop. He told Ruth that he was exploring the area and meeting new people, but Jesse was actually looking for potential victims. He had learned from his previous experiences and was now planning his attacks much more carefully. Jesse noticed that there were many children in the area who walked to school alone or played in isolated spots where no one would see them. He began following certain children and learning their daily routines just as he had done before his arrest. Jesse was particularly interested in children who seemed shy or friendless because he knew they would be less likely to tell adults about meeting a strange older boy. On March 18, 1874, 10-year-old Katie Curran was walking home from school through the streets of South Boston. Katie was a quiet girl who lived with her mother and helped take care of her younger siblings. She often walked home alone because her mother worked long hours and could not meet her after school. Jesse had been watching Katie for several days and knew exactly what time she would be walking past his mother's shop. On this particular afternoon, Jesse stepped outside the shop and called to Katie asking if she would like to buy some candy for her little brothers and sisters. Katie was a kind girl who loved her siblings, so she followed Jesse into the shop to look at the candy selection. Ruth Pomeroy was not in the shop that afternoon because she had gone to buy supplies for the business. Jesse was alone with Katie and saw this as the perfect opportunity to act on the violent fantasies he had been developing since his release from reform school. But what Jesse did to Katie Curran that day would be far worse than anything he had done to his previous victims. Katie Curran would never walk home from school again, and her disappearance would mark the beginning of Jesse Pomeroy's transformation from a serial attacker into something much more dangerous. The brief taste of freedom had not cured Jesse of his violent desires, but had instead given him time to plan something truly horrific. Katie Curran never returned home from school on March 18, 1874. And her mother Margaret began to worry when darkness fell, and her daughter had still not appeared. Margaret walked through the streets of South Boston calling Katie's name and asking neighbors if they had seen the 10-year-old girl. By midnight, Margaret was frantic with fear and went to the police station to report her daughter missing. Detective James Wood was assigned to investigate Katie's disappearance, and he immediately felt a cold dread in his stomach. Wood remembered the white-haired boy who had terrorized the children of Boston 2 years earlier and wondered if Jesse Pomeroy might be involved in Katie's disappearance. The detective knew that Jesse had been released from reform school just 1 month earlier. Detective Wood began his investigation by tracing Katie's usual route home from school. He spoke with shopkeepers and residents along the path and learned that several people had seen Katie walking normally until she reached the area near the Pomeroy family shop. After that point, no one remembered seeing the girl, and it was as if she had simply vanished into thin air. When Detective Wood questioned Ruth Pomeroy about Katie's disappearance, the worried mother insisted that Jesse had been working in the shop all afternoon and could not have been involved. Ruth showed the detective the inventory records that Jesse had been updating and pointed out that her son seemed to be doing well since his release from reform school. But Detective Wood noticed that Jesse was unusually calm and helpful during the questioning. Most innocent people became nervous or upset when questioned about a missing child, but Jesse answered every question with a polite smile and seemed almost eager to help with the investigation. This behavior reminded Detective Wood of how Jesse had acted during his original arrest 2 years earlier. The search for Katie Curran continued for weeks, but no trace of the girl could be found. Detective Wood organized search parties that looked through every abandoned building, vacant lot, and wooded area within miles of where Katie had last been seen. The detective also questioned every known criminal in the area, but none of them had any information about the missing girl. As March turned into April, Ruth Pomeroy began to relax and believe that her son was not involved in Katie's disappearance. Jesse continued to work in the shop and behave like a normal teenager, and Ruth convinced herself that whatever had happened to Katie had nothing to do with her family. But Jesse was already planning his next attack, and this time, he intended to go much further than he had ever gone before. On the morning of April 22, 1874, 4-year-old Horace Millen woke up in his small apartment and asked his mother if he could go outside to play. Horace was a cheerful little boy with curly brown hair and bright blue eyes who loved to explore the neighborhood and chase the stray cats that lived in the alleys around South Boston. Horace's mother, Catherine, was busy preparing breakfast for her husband who worked at the nearby docks, and she told Horace he could play outside for 1 hour before coming home for lunch. Catherine had heard about Katie Curran's disappearance, but she believed that Horace would be safe playing near their apartment building where many neighbors could see him. Horace ran outside and began playing with a wooden hoop that he rolled along the sidewalk with a stick. The little boy was having fun and did not notice the white-haired teenager who was watching him from across the street. Jesse Pomeroy had been waiting for the right opportunity to strike again, and Horace seemed like the perfect victim. Jesse approached Horace and complimented him on his skill with the wooden hoop. Jesse told the 4-year-old that he knew an even better place to play, where there were no carriages or horses to worry about. Horace was trusting and eager to make a new friend, so he followed Jesse away from the busy streets toward the salt marshes on the outskirts of the city. The walk to the marshes took 30 minutes, and Jesse spent the time talking to Horace about games and toys, to keep the little boy calm and cooperative. Jesse had learned during his time at reform school that frightened victims were harder to control, so he wanted Horace to remain relaxed until they reached the isolated area where no one would interrupt them. When they arrived at the marshes, Jesse told Horace that they were going to play a special game that only brave boys were allowed to play. Jesse explained that the game involved lying very still, while Jesse performed various tests to see how brave Horace really was. The 4-year-old was excited to prove his bravery and agreed to participate in Jesse's game. What happened next in those remote salt marshes was the most horrific crime that Boston had ever seen. Jesse had brought a large knife that he had stolen from his mother's shop, and he used it to attack Horace with a savagery that went far beyond anything he had done to his previous victims. This time Jesse did not stop at causing pain and terror but crossed the line into something much darker. Jesse stabbed Horace multiple times, and then used the knife to mutilate the little boy's body in ways that showed he had completely lost any trace of human compassion. Jesse spent over an hour with Horace's body, and seemed to be conducting some kind of twisted experiment on the dead child. When Jesse was finally finished, he left Horace's remains in the marsh and walked calmly back to South Boston. Horace's mother, Catherine, became worried when her son did not return home for lunch, and she began searching the neighborhood for him. Other parents joined the search, and by evening, dozens of people were looking for the missing 4-year-old boy. The search continued through the night and expanded to areas outside the immediate neighborhood. On the morning of April 23rd, a man who was collecting shellfish in the salt marshes discovered Horace's body and immediately ran to notify the police. Detective Wood arrived at the scene and was horrified by what he found. The level of violence that had been inflicted on the 4-year-old child was beyond anything Wood had encountered in his 20 years as a police officer. The condition of Horace's body made it clear that this was not a random crime of opportunity, but the work of someone who had planned the attack carefully and who had experience with violence. Detective Wood immediately thought of Jesse Pomeroy and realized that the white-haired boy had graduated from assault to murder. A massive manhunt was organized to find Jesse and bring him to justice for the murder of Horace Millen. Police officers searched every building in South Boston and questioned everyone who might have seen Jesse on the day of the murder. The community was gripped by fear and anger as word spread about the brutal killing of an innocent 4-year-old child. Jesse was found hiding in a railroad car at South Station, trying to board a train that would take him out of Massachusetts. When the police arrested him, Jesse showed no signs of remorse or fear, and seemed almost relieved that his secret was finally out. Jesse confessed to killing Horace Millen and also revealed what had happened to Katie Curran, whose body was found hidden in the basement of his mother's shop. The monster had finally been caught, but the damage he had caused would haunt the families and community of Boston for the rest of their lives. Jesse Pomeroy had become America's youngest serial killer, and his crimes would change how the legal system dealt with violent juvenile offenders forever. The news of Jesse Pomeroy's arrest for the murder of Horace Millen spread across Boston like wildfire and then traveled throughout the entire United States. Newspapers from New York to California carried headlines about the 14-year-old boy who had killed a 4-year-old child in the most brutal manner imaginable. The American public had never heard of such a young person committing such horrible crimes. Jesse's trial began on December 9, 1874 in the Suffolk County Courthouse, and it became one of the most sensational legal proceedings in American history. The courthouse was packed every day with reporters, curious citizens, and angry community members who wanted to see justice done. Many people in the crowd called for Jesse to be executed despite his young age. The prosecutor, District Attorney Oliver Stevens, presented evidence that painted Jesse as a cold-blooded killer who had planned and carried out the murder of Horace Millen with deliberate cruelty. Stevens argued that Jesse's age should not protect him from the full consequences of his actions, and that the safety of other children required that Jesse be put to death. Jesse's defense attorney, Charles Robinson, faced an almost impossible task in trying to save his client's life. Robinson argued that Jesse was mentally ill and could not be held fully responsible for his actions. The defense attorney brought in several doctors who testified that Jesse showed signs of moral insanity and brain damage that made him unable to understand right from wrong. But the prosecution countered with evidence that Jesse was highly intelligent and had carefully planned his crimes. Prosecutor Stevens pointed out that Jesse had successfully hidden his attacks for months and had shown clear understanding that what he was doing was wrong by threatening his victims to keep them quiet. Jesse himself seemed strangely detached from the proceedings and often appeared bored during the testimony about his crimes. He would sit quietly in his chair and sometimes take notes as if he was studying the legal process rather than fighting for his life. Jesse showed no emotion when the gruesome details of his attacks were described to the jury. The most dramatic moment of the trial came when Jesse took the witness stand to testify in his own defense. For 2 hours, Jesse answered questions about his childhood, his time at reform school, and the murders of Katie Curran and Horace Millen. Jesse spoke in a calm, measured voice and showed no signs of regret or sorrow for what he had done. When Prosecutor Stevens asked Jesse if he felt sorry for killing Horace Millen, Jesse paused for a long moment and then said that he felt sorry that he had been caught, but not sorry that the boy was dead. This answer shocked everyone in the courtroom and probably sealed Jesse's fate with the jury. Jesse went on to explain that he had enjoyed killing Horace, and that the experience had been even more satisfying than the attacks he had committed on his earlier victims. Jesse said that he had been planning to kill more children, and that he would probably continue killing if he was ever released from prison. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning with a verdict of guilty of murder in the first degree. Under Massachusetts law, this meant that Jesse would be sentenced to death by hanging. Jesse listened to the verdict without showing any emotion and simply nodded when the judge asked if he understood what had been decided. Judge Horace Gray scheduled Jesse's execution for September 23, 1875, and Jesse was moved to the death row section of Charlestown State Prison to await his fate. But Jesse's case sparked a massive public debate about whether it was right to execute such a young person even for the most horrible crimes. Religious leaders, newspaper editors, and reform-minded citizens argued that executing a 14-year-old boy would be a barbarity that would reflect poorly on American civilization. They pointed out that Jesse was still a child despite his crimes, and that society should focus on rehabilitation rather than revenge. But the families of Jesse's victims and many other citizens demanded that justice be carried out regardless of Jesse's age. They argued that Jesse had shown no mercy to his young victims and deserved none in return. These people believed that letting Jesse live would send a dangerous message that young criminals could escape the full consequences of their actions. The controversy reached all the way to the governor of Massachusetts, who had the power to commute Jesse's death sentence to life in prison. Governor William Gaston spent months reviewing the case and consulting with legal experts, religious leaders, and members of the legislature about what should be done. On August 31, 1875, just 3 weeks before Jesse's scheduled execution, Governor Gaston announced that he was commuting the death sentence to life imprisonment. The governor stated that while Jesse's crimes were horrific, the state should not execute someone who had committed murder before reaching the age of 15. Jesse received the news of his commutation with the same emotionless reaction he had shown throughout his trial. He simply nodded when the warden informed him that he would spend the rest of his life in prison rather than being executed. Jesse seemed neither relieved nor disappointed by this development. Jesse was moved to a solitary confinement cell in Charlestown State Prison, where he would spend the next 58 years of his life. The cell was small and dark, with only a tiny window that let in a small amount of sunlight during the day. Jesse was allowed out of his cell for 1 hour each day to exercise in a small yard, surrounded by high walls. During his decades in prison, Jesse continued to show the same lack of remorse that had characterized him since childhood. He never expressed any regret for his crimes or sympathy for his victims and their families. Jesse spent his time reading books and writing letters to people who were fascinated by his case. Jesse also continued to display violent tendencies even while in prison. He attacked several guards over the years and made weapons from materials he found in his cell. Prison officials learned that Jesse could never be trusted and had to be watched constantly to prevent him from hurting other people. As the years passed, Jesse became something of a celebrity criminal, with people from around the world writing to him and asking about his crimes. Jesse seemed to enjoy the attention, and would often write detailed letters describing his memories of the attacks and murders. These letters horrified the people who received them, but also provided insight into the mind of one of America's first documented serial killers. Jesse Pomeroy died in his prison cell on September 29, 1932, at the age of 72. He had spent 58 years in prison, making him one of the longest-serving inmates in American history. Jesse had outlived all of his victims, their families, and most of the people who had been involved in his trial and conviction. The death of Jesse Pomeroy marked the end of one of the most disturbing criminal cases in American history. Jesse had terrorized an entire city, brutally attacked 7 children, and murdered 2 others, all before his 15th birthday. His case had forced the American legal system to grapple with questions about juvenile crime and punishment that are still debated today. The legacy of Jesse Pomeroy extends far beyond his individual crimes. His case helped establish new procedures for dealing with violent juvenile offenders and contributed to the development of the field of criminal psychology. Jesse's crimes also served as a stark reminder that evil can emerge from the most unexpected places and that society must remain vigilant in protecting its most vulnerable members. The families of Jesse's victims never fully recovered from the trauma he inflicted on them and their communities, but their suffering led to important changes in how children are protected and how warning signs of violent behavior are recognized and addressed. In this way, the victims of Jesse Pomeroy made a lasting contribution to the safety of future generations of children. Jesse Pomeroy remains one of the youngest serial killers in American history, and his case continues to fascinate and horrify people more than 150 years after his crimes were committed. His story serves as a chilling reminder of the capacity for evil that can exist even in the youngest members of society.